Well, good evening and welcome to our evening session of our first Monday Speaker Series with Justin Giboney. I am Justin Bailey and I serve as Assistant Professor of Theology here at Dorothy University. And it's my privilege, again, to introduce our presenter tonight. Justin Giboney is the co-founder and president of the AND campaign, which aims at cultivating what they call a gospel-centric worldview and is committed to redemptive justice and values-based policy. He is also the co-author of a new book, Compassion and Conviction. He is an attorney and political strategist in Atlanta, and the title of his talk is A Distinct Public Witness. So we are going to have Justin speak to us for about 25 minutes or so, and then after that time, we'll engage him in a conversation, and we'll ask you please to use the Q&A feature of the webinar rather than the chat box. So without further ado, Justin Giboney.
Thank you for that introduction, Justin. I appreciate it. I'd like to thank, let me just say it's an honor to have the opportunity to speak to Dorothy University today. I'd like to thank President Hoekstra and others for the invitation. I know this isn't always an easy subject to talk about, but I am honored that you would entrust this opportunity to me. Well, as we all know, an election is coming tomorrow, and the saints are uptight, nerves are frayed, Twitter fingers are quick and calloused, and to make matters more complicated, we know that a Supreme Court justice just passed away and one was sworn in. There's even a question as to whether partisans on both sides of the aisle are in the state of mind or in the emotional state to accept an unfavorable electoral outcome. Social media is a war zone where even Christians proclaim empty ideological rhetoric like it's the gospel, spitting buzzwords and vitriol like it's the good news. Some right-leaning Christians have conspicuously stopped talking about Christian compassion, while left-leaning Christians wouldn't dare let their progressive friends catch them tweeting affirmation of the sanctity of life or the Christian sexual ethic. Some conservatives are acting like the videos of police brutality don't exist, while progressives pretend that that violent crime doesn't exist, and all the while the grassroots continue to suffer under the tyranny of both realities. Come quickly, Lord Jesus. I'm not here to tell you who to vote for, but make no mistake that tomorrow matters. Elections have consequences, and this is no time for indecision or ambiguity. Our faith ought not be used as a means of escapism or a way of denying the weight and gravity of the moment. We must step into the tension of the time and let our public witness reflect our God-given identity and purpose in the civic space. Our faith, however, should provide perspective, a foundation and firm footing in uncertain and tumultuous times. Christian civic engagement is the art and science of applying the sacred to the secular, while not allowing the secular to become sacred. Take this election seriously, but let not your faith rest on the results of this election. What'll be the condition of your heart on November 4th and the perhaps weeks and months of fallout thereafter? Will you be drunk off the thrill of victory, reveling in the triumphalism of a tribal win? Alternatively, will you be wallowing in the bitter agony of defeat, brokenhearted without a word of hope or encouragement for your suffering neighbor? Or will you faithfully remain sober and resolved in the encouragement or discouragement of the outcome, judicious and unbowed, knowing that an election, win or lose, never fully determines the fate of those your civic action was intended to defend? The immigrant, the uninsured, and the unborn will still need clear-eyed and persistent advocates no matter who wins the Oval Office, the Senate, and the House. You see, every 4 years, we're promised our every heart's desire and left with a handful of IOUs and excuses when the people we fawned over don't deliver. When will we realize that no election is ever really a decisive victory for Christians in and of itself? It's not a time to hand off the rights and concerns of those in need to the next group of ambitious politicians. We can't simply wait for others to deliver. We have to deliver. It's time for Christians to re-articulate and reapply the compassion and conviction of the gospel, and to hold those elected accountable, whether we voted for them or not, but especially if we voted for them. When November 4th and the unpredictable thereafter comes, will you remain vigilant, waiting and watching? Will you hold Democrats accountable for the low-income housing crisis in their districts, where poor people can't even live in urban centers unless they're living on the streets? Will you hold Republicans accountable for how their healthcare policies or lack thereof have shut down rural hospitals, leaving those who are dying of deaths of despair in even more desperate situations? Or will you settle for defending your party and your tribe at all costs? Will you be too caught up in the fray to think critically and to avoid becoming a generic Republican or a generic Democrat? You see, the AND campaign has consistently asserted that Christians are in need of a complete paradigm shift, an entirely different way of thinking when it comes to how we view and engage politics. We must re-examine and assess our identity and purpose in the cultural and political space. Who are we in the socio-political arena, and what have we been sent to accomplish? Not what do you want to accomplish or what do you think it's in your best interest to accomplish, but what has a just and righteous God sent you to accomplish? It's okay to be in a political party, but Lord, have mercy on our souls if we continually allow Christian political engagement to be a weak, knockoff version of political conservatism or secular progressivism, a mediocre theatrical display of American pride and prejudice, where Christians outsource our public political opinions and social action to washed up political parties. God forbid that our civic work would continue to be an unimaginative and sloppy construct of counterfeit architecture, tailor-made in the image of the idols of the day. Many of us have a hard time delineating where our partisanship ends and where our political theology begins. If we're seeking validation from progressives, then we'll be willing to embrace a social justice with no moral anchor. That's a lesser justice. On the other hand, if our desire is to be confirmed by conservatives, then we'll espouse a morality that lacks compassion, a perverted sense of law and order that lacks justice. Again, a lesser justice. But you see, Christian political engagement must be detached from the broken partisanship and mob mentality politics that are prevalent today. Our contribution can no longer perpetuate the mess that plagues our political landscape. In Nehemiah 6, it tells us that when Nehemiah was rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem, a group of men who had already conspired against him asked him to come down and have a conversation with them. He responded in verse 3 by saying, "I am doing a great work. I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you?" Christian political engagement must be understood and approached in the same way, as a profound civic work, a great work. And hyperpartisanship, pettiness, and the mob mentality amount to coming down, to descending. It's stopping the work and attending to distractions that separate us from our mission. On November 4th and whatsoever happens thereafter, will you come down or will you continue building, continue doing a great work? Christian politics must be more than Christian self-interest. It must be more than a hobby or sadistic entertainment. It can't just be about waiting for the next clip of our political opponents to be humiliated. My proposition today is that political engagement for the Christian isn't primarily an occasion to pursue our preferences and financial interests, nor should it be used as a tool to settle the score with our most bitter rivals. On the contrary, Christian political engagement is a robust opportunity to love our neighbors by defending human dignity and promoting human flourishing. It's a forum for displaying the justice and moral order of a God who so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Our public witness must be a distinctly faith-based endeavor that can only be accomplished by those who have genuinely been crucified with Christ, and as a result are able to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with their God, not just theoretically or in the abstract, but in our daily public witness, which is more difficult than it sounds. Let's think about it. To act justly, even when our tribe urges us to abuse our power through acts of vengeance, to love mercy in the presence of bloodthirsty allies and opponents who have viciously wronged us, to walk humbly in a culture that promotes identity idolatry and unlimited self-expression at all costs. Our political engagement must be a profound civic work. Again, a great work. It's not to be taken lightly or to be used for our own frivolous purposes. Let me give you a historical example. Imagine, if you will, Frederick Douglass preparing to debate on the subject of abolition as his people continue to suffer through the dark night of American slavery. Pen in hand, memories of braided bullwhips and rusted chains running through his mind, knowing that as he wrote, knowing full well that his brothers were still being beaten like mules and his sisters were still having their babies torn from their grasp, raped and disregarded without recourse. And yet, he still had to construct a cogent, constitutional, and moral case without allowing his emotions to pull him into logical fallacies. He still had to articulate the pain of generations of disinherited Black souls without flinching or sinning under the weight of his anger. This couldn't have been just a casual or haphazard undertaking. It certainly wasn't a task to be neglected or trifled with. No, it was an opportunity to knock down the gates of hell, a chance to expose the devil's dealings and to emancipate God's children and change the world. As he shrewdly maneuvered through the halls of power, this couldn't have been just another day at the office, a leisure stroll through the civic landscape. No, it was a chance to slay giants, to bid the kingdom come, a chance to serve notice about God's will and to advocate that his will be done. How dare we waste our words trading insult for insult? How dare we waste our time on tweeting instead of policymaking? How dare we waste our witness paying homage to inept partisan idols, when we have people looking at us to hear what God has to say about the matter? Our public witness is a declaration of faith, a testament to the excellence of being bound to the ultimate purveyor of grace and truth. A Christian public witness confined to the limits of progressivism or conservatism is a witness squandered, a light hidden, a praise and worship chorus muted. Does our political engagement reveal the will of God to others, so that even if we lose a particular political battle, we have still testified? We've still borne witness. We've still shined a light in the darkness. The state of your public witness on November 4th and the toxic thereafter will greatly depend on if you're able to proceed with moral imagination. Moral imagination is the ability to see not simply what has been historically or what is in the present moment, but it's the ability to see what could be in the future, what ought to be. It's hope in the midst of oppression, division, and vitriol. It's not a pipe dream. It's the Hebrew vision of the land promised, but yet to come. It's what convinced Frederick Douglass to learn how to read and how to write while still in chains, and when nothing in his physical line of sight indicated that he'd ever be able to use his talents. Moral imagination is exactly what our socio-political landscape is missing today. You see, we settle for Pyrrhic political victories because we can't see past this election cycle. We trade insult for insult because we don't have the moral imagination to understand that human dignity isn't scarce. We don't have to battle over it. We don't have to hoard it. It's abundant and innate. Those with moral imagination refuse to lower the standard. They refuse to lower the discourse just because their opponents have chosen to wade in the mire and the muck. They have the capacity to play by the rules, even when they've taken a loss at the hands of foul play. It takes moral imagination not to have an opposition-centered public witness in a polarized environment. It takes moral imagination to see what the moment is hiding from you. It reveals what's there, but undetected by conventional wisdom. Moral imagination prevents us from being enslaved by the moment. It enables us to participate in partisan politics without seeing the world through a partisan lens. It assures us that there's more than two ways to solve a problem. And it also emboldens us to uphold timeless Christian convictions, even when popular culture mocks us, even when popular culture threatens us. It reveals that there's love in inconvenient truths. Faith produces moral imagination, and moral imagination affords us the vision, aspiration, and determination to build a better civic space, even when the prospects of doing so seem bleak or even irrational. It gives us the capacity to see and to understand what we have in common with someone who is taunting or offending us. Moral imagination forces us to recall that everyone has a story and everyone has a testimony, even when their anger and their prejudices hide it from us. The civil rights movement was an exercise in moral imagination. It was the demonstration of the vision, endurance necessary to build any great work of civic architecture. It was one of the most muscular public displays of democracy shaping this country has ever witnessed. It didn't overlook the present, but it wasn't limited by the present. When civil rights freedom fighters sang songs about keeping their eyes on the prize, they weren't talking about a prize that they could see physically. They were referring to a prize that had to be imagined through the lens of faith. They were describing a telos not blurred by the myopia of the present. That even when their eyes were swollen shut by batons or blinded by tear gas, they could see the reward of a faithful and dignified public witness. And what they saw allowed them to begin to correct and shape a derelict nation, a nation that couldn't be repaired by the tools of postmodernism or the tools of rugged individualism, a nation that had to more acutely understand and apply the principles it had already professed. We have to see that a faithful public witness is more valuable than a compromised political win. Loving our neighbor is more important than dictating the terms. What will be the state of your public witness on November 4th and the hectic thereafter? When the confetti falls and the tears roll, will your victory or defeat be in the moment or in something much, much greater? Will your faith be in the promises of the politicians elected, or will it be in the one who chose the elect? What will be the state of your compassion and conviction on November 4th and the hostile thereafter? Who will you be when November 4th comes? Because it is coming. God bless you and thank you for having me.
Well, Justin, thank you so much for being with us. We wish that you were here in person, of course, and but it's such a gift that you get to be with us in this format. I wanted to ask you to start out with, before we open it up for attendees. There's just so much happening right now that you've alluded to. Maybe we could talk about it as symptoms of a disease. I read a study this morning that said that 64% of people surveyed said that they're experiencing significant stress because of this election, so much so that they're losing sleep. 72% people of color. We have stories of church members leaving churches over politics, pastors stepping down or being kicked out due to preaching overly political sermons. We have, maybe closer to home, families not speaking to each other as Thanksgiving approaches over these things. What would you say, as you look at all these symptoms and the heightened anxiety and angst that we feel right now? I guess as a political strategist, we hear a lot of times, this is the most important election ever, right? Do you see there being a significant difference? And what would you say is the source of our anxiety and our angst in relationship to this particular election cycle?
Yeah, I think the source of the angst and just that tension is the polarization in our political landscape. I mean, this is a very polarized moment. I wouldn't say it's the worst moment in American history. I think there were times where we probably should have been more polarized than we were because there were some pretty bad things going on. But at the same time, I think in so many ways, politics has become religious in nature, right? Like we look to politics to get out of it what we used to get from other places. And that's just unfortunate. I think we have to put it back in perspective. And I think that's a place where pastors, especially, and faith leaders can put this back into perspective to help people understand that this is of consequence. So it's okay to be concerned. It's okay to be a little bit anxious because this is a consequential moment, but it's not ultimate. And, you know, it's one vote and the world will continue to move and go on after this vote happens. But we have to have perspective. And as Christians, we always have to try to find that joy. And so that's not to say that people don't have a reason to be worried or a reason to, want one side to win and the other to lose. But it does mean that at the end of the day, we have to, and that's what I was trying to address in my talk, we have to know that it's a vote and that we're going to have to keep fighting regardless of what happens. And there's so many other things we can do to help people in our community. A vote's important, but the vote's not ultimate.
Yeah, thank you. Let me remind all of the attendees that you can ask a question to Justin by typing it in the question and answer. Don't use the chat feature, though we will try to see that if you do, but we are trying to use the question and answer feature. I'm going to ask the first question that has come in, and it is from President Hoekstra. And President Hoekstra says, first he said he'd speak so hopefully and eloquently about the AND campaign. He's captivated. His question is, he says, I feel so hindered by the binary choice in this country's two-party system and feel politically homeless sometimes. Where do you see hope that the third way can become more than a speech and create a home for people like me to become a movement or even a party?
Well, I think my hope in some sense comes from Christians saying they do feel somewhat homeless. I think that's a good thing. I know it doesn't feel good, but I think the bigger problem is when Christians have no issue with their party, when Christians just feel, that their party completely represents them. When I hear Christians say they feel that tension, they're looking for a different way to do that, to me, that is encouraging because we're recognizing that there's a problem. There's something that needs to be solved rather than just settling for what we have. Now, when we talk about a third way, sometimes people are talking about a third party. I would love to see a third party. The truth of the matter is that that's a very heavy lift. And so I'm not never going to say it's impossible, but it could take some time. But something that I think we could do in the meantime is Christians sitting down together from different parties and finding what we can agree on, regardless of what side we're on. Now, there should be 5 to 10 issues where Christians say, hey, we're going to support candidates regardless of what party they're in that support these type of issues. If we're able to do that, then we can create a coalition within the two parties that could really change the whole landscape. It doesn't have to be a new party to change the landscape, but if people change how they vote and how they think about the issues, it changes really the dynamics. And so I'm glad to hear leaders speaking about this homelessness. You can feel homeless and still be in a party because as I talked about, a party should be used as a tool, in my opinion. But it's good that we feel that tension. So much of the Christian life is a tension. And the problem is when we're numb to that tension. So I worry more about Christians who feel nothing, no issue with their party whatsoever.
Thank you. Yeah, another question. This one is from Lexi, and her question is about politics in the church. If you could scroll with things. How do politics in the church tie together? What is the role of preaching the word in politics, and how can pastors keep separation of church and state, or should they? What should churches do? How can churches create a space for dialogue and stress the importance of social justice?
Yeah, I think the first thing we have to realize when we talk about this is that the gospel has political implications, whether we like it or not. I mean, if you're truly transformed by the gospel, then it will show through how you vote, how you talk to people, what you advocate for. And so the gospel has always had political implications because the gospel deals with ultimate authority. And if there's an ultimate authority, that means that some other people that may put themselves in a position of ultimate authority really don't have that. And so I think it's a good place to start. But I think one of the concerns and where that question comes from is we do know that if we let politics into the church too much and controls parts of the church, then it can corrupt the church. It can do negative things. So I'm not one of those people that acts like politics can't have a bad impact. But I also think that it's a problem if we ignore it. So we need to and that's one of the things the AND campaign tries to do in the book Compassion and Conviction, is create a framework so Christians understand how to address politics, how to engage it in a healthy way, but also where to say, no, politics can't enter in here. So I think pastors, play a great role, as I said before, in framing the issues and framing the situation and giving people perspective on certain issues. But I don't know that they should necessarily be in the pulpit endorsing and things of that nature. That's where it shouldn't happen. And so that's the other thing that I would mention is there's a huge misunderstanding or misconception when it comes to the separation between church and state. It does not mean that we shouldn't use our values or apply our values when it comes to political issues. If you're not applying Christian values, then you're really just applying somebody else's values. That's not what that concept is for. It just means we shouldn't establish a religion in America, and that you shouldn't be kept from practicing your religion in a real way.
Thank you. The next question comes from Chloe, and Chloe's question is about the concept of moral imagination. Could you say a little bit more about moral imagination and how do we develop it? What are the practices, perhaps, that will enable us to cultivate a moral imagination?
Yeah, I think it starts with faith. Faith, you can look through history and show how people having faith made them see past a bad situation to a better situation. And that's really been the story of Black people in America. I mean, situations where there was really no reason to have hope, but yet you found hope based on the promises of the gospel, which allowed you to see past what was right in front of you. And so I think when we talk about moral imagination, it's being able to look at the system and how it's presented to us and actually see what's wrong with it and how it should be. You see, too many people, I think, look at our political landscape and they see this binary choice. They see what the two parties present and they say, I have to choose one. This is the only way that it's going to work. Anything else is a waste of time. Well, to me, that's a lack of moral imagination. I don't think moral imagination is impractical, but it keeps you from being paralyzed by how things are presented to you or the narratives that are in front of us. And so moral imagination is something that's cultivated through our faith. It allows us to see how things ought to be and gives us the courage to strive for something different than what is at the moment. And I think it's prayer, it's being in community, educating ourselves and really digging into the word to know God's promises. That's what gives us moral imagination.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? Is it mainly a matter of seeing possibilities that other people don't see? Is it primarily a function of hope that maybe you don't understand, you don't think, you can't even imagine how it could be better, but you know that it can? Is it concrete or is it expecting God to show up in some way, even if you don't know how God would show up?
Well, it can manifest in different ways, but I think it's not just accepting a bad situation. It's not just accepting how people present something to you. It's actually knowing that things can be better. It's believing the best in people that you can. So to give you an example, if you were to say something to me that was very negative and disparaging, I wouldn't be able to, after that, it may be hard for me to see your human dignity. Human dignity is not something you can see, right? But based on moral imagination, I know that regardless of what you say to me, that you still have worth, that you still have value. Now, can I see that with my eyes? No, I can't see it with my eyes, but I know what the Bible tells me, right? So I have to see past what you said to me and see who you really are per the Imago Dei and per what the Bible says about you. So that's just one example of how.
Yeah, thanks for that example. The next question is from Lexi, and she asks about the role of humility, and especially how do you speak and act in humility, especially with respect to perhaps other Christians, when you feel that you are better than them or that you can see more clearly than them, or that there's something that they are neglecting? How do you act in humility? Even the whole conversation about being quote unquote woke, right? That you are awake to what's really going on, whereas others are not. How do you conduct yourself in humility in the political arena?
Yeah, well, I think it starts by not feeling that you're better than anyone, even if you have a stronger grasp on something than someone else. And that's really a key. You know, I've seen people who just really caught on to the race conversation within the last 5 years of when Mike Brown got shot. But as soon as they catch on to it, they expect everybody else to catch on it as soon as them. I mean, those are some of the most impatient people with others. And so I think it's just realizing that you're not perfect, that you may get one issue, but there's probably an issue that you don't get, because none of us can know about every issue and be informed about every single issue. And so having that humility to say, you know what, I'm going to be patient, I'm going to listen, and I'm really going to stand in with people who are trying to learn. That's one way to be humble. It doesn't mean that it's kind of a relativism to say that we're all, you know, we're all right and things of that nature. No, they can be wrong, but understanding that you've been wrong too, and that somebody might have been patient with you allows you to have humility when you walk into conversations with others. And I think as I've talked about earlier, it's really about walking into those conversations, not trying to come out on top, not trying to come out as if you're faultless, but coming out of those conversations having understood what the other person is saying and understood their point of view. If you go into it thinking that you're better than them or that you have it all down, not only is that, I think, unfaithful, but it's not going to be a very constructive conversation.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is maybe a little bit more personal. Well, first of all, David says, thank you for your fervor and your courage. He also echoes the fact that he feels that sense of homelessness. And his question for you is, how do you imagine navigating your future civic service or even running for political office? He says, hopefully you will do that, while holding your convictions closely. Can you, or can a person realistically run and survive with, for example, your perspectives on human life and dignity, regardless of which political party you're affiliated with?
Yeah, I think folks have done it. I think you look in Louisiana, State Senator Katrina Jackson. I think if you look at John Bell Edwards down there, who was the governor, those are examples of people who have very similar convictions, but have stood up for them. But I will say that it's tough. And the reason that it's tough is that we don't incentivize people to do that. We kind of wait for other people to incentivize it. Or when one of us gets attacked for it, we're not organized enough to defend them. And so I think it's incumbent on the church and Christians to revive institutions, to create new institutions, to incentivize people who are taking that perspective. Now, I don't think it's my call to run for office, but I do want to see young people. I want to see others who have the courage to be distinct. My conversation today was about being distinct in character, being distinct in your public witness as you go out into the public space. And so, we have to help people do that. We have to come together in community, and we have to create institutions and really an infrastructure for people to run in that way. It's not just going to help happen by itself, but there are brave folks out there. I'm certainly not even close to the only one. So hopefully we all find encouragement in that.
Do you have plans in the future to run for political office, or do you primarily see yourself working as a political strategist and helping lift others up?
I don't have plans. I don't say this often, but I think, when I entered into this ministry, one of the things that helped me was not having any plans for office. That way I said what I had to say, even when, I felt like nobody else was really, not a whole lot of other people were saying it. So no, that's not in my plans, but I do plan to help young people who have that drive, who have that fortitude to do that themselves. Yeah.
I appreciate you describing it as ministry, and it fits in very well with what we try to emphasize here at Dort about all of life being service and doing ministry with whatever vocation God calls you into. Another question that we had is about apathy, and especially with respect to college students. How do we help college students avoid apathy, especially when the tone of the conversation is so antagonistic? It makes most of them want to just check out. If that's how the adults in the room are acting, and they're being so antagonistic towards one another, how do we keep college students especially from just checking out of the conversation?
Well, I think one, by explaining to them that it doesn't get better unless people are willing to do it differently. And also explaining that whether we like it or not, politics touches every aspect of society. So as we see, whether or not we can go to church is touched by politics. What we eat, what's in our food, and the standards for what's in our food, what children learn in school, the quality of our water. All these things are touched by politics. And so it's remiss to just allow others to make those decisions for you. Again, part of the Christian life is going into situations that aren't so pleasant and shining a light in those situations. And I think that we are remiss when we don't take the time to use such a robust tool like politics to try to change the lives of those in need. This is a tool that God has given us. We have to be cautious. We have to be thoughtful. But it's such an opportunity to do good. So don't just focus on the bad things. This is a question that we answer directly in the book, Compassion and Conviction. There's so many great things that Christians have done through politics and just have been done through politics generally, where you talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act. I mean, people don't even understand how hard it was for people with disabilities just to get around before that act came around. But guess what? Some people thought it was important. They advocated for it and they got it passed. And it really changed the quality of life for people with disabilities. This is something that doesn't happen if people don't take the time to engage in the civic arena. It's worth it. You can help a lot of people, and it's rewarding when you do.
Thank you. Another question from somebody who's asking if they want to get into politics as a candidate, as a career. They ask, can you give me any hope that I could be taken seriously as a young Republican if I want to show care and love for the poor through creating challenging career opportunities or through non-government created ideas? Or can you give me hope that I can be taken seriously as a young Democrat if I want to speak out against abortion?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to take yourself seriously, to learn as much as you can about the issues, to get to know different groups. And one of the things that I always recommend to people is work on a campaign. Choose a couple, choose a candidate that you believe in and just volunteer. You don't have to get paid. Volunteer. And if you work hard, one thing I know about campaigns, if you're a hard worker and you're trustworthy, you'll get a lot of experience just by volunteering and being consistent. So you got to believe in yourself. You got to, and one thing a great mentor told me is like, when you go into politics, if that's what you want to do, you have to know where your core is. You have to know what you will never do, the things that you will refuse to do because of your ethics. And you also have to know the things that you want to do, what you want to accomplish. I think, the party stuff will come. I think you can be taken seriously in any party if you take yourself seriously and you learn as much as you can and make good relationships, then you'll have a fighting chance. But I think for you, the goal, the objective can't be just to be a good politician. The objective needs to be about protecting human dignity and promoting human flourishing. That's what'll make you, that's what'll make it worth it for you and maintain your integrity.
Justin, can I ask you, can you tell us a little bit of the story of how you got involved in doing the work, or as you call it, the ministry that you're doing? And then also, what sort of people or what sort of character or personality will thrive doing this sort of work or this sort of ministry?
Yeah, so for me, when I first got to Atlanta, I was an attorney. I was working at a law firm, and I had a group of friends that were always talking about politics and sports. And one day I said, guys, why do we keep just talking about this? We should actually do something about it. There's no reason why we can't participate in politics in Atlanta. And so there was a mayoral race coming up, maybe a year and a half after that conversation. We did our research. We actually created memos for all the candidates that we thought would have a chance of winning. We chose, someone who we thought would be the best candidate. And we went and basically knocked on the campaign door and said, how can we help? And that was the beginning of a political career for me that's been had a lot of ups and downs, but I've certainly learned a lot. I'll be honest with you, I didn't initially, when I got into politics, I wasn't initially connecting my faith with politics. That wasn't an intersection that I was as serious about as I should have been. And just over time, seeing kind of a lack of organization when it came to Christians, seeing Christians feeling like they had to get rid of some of their values to even participate. I think God just put it on my heart to step in and say something has to change and trying to organize Christians around it.
Then is there a certain kind of personality that you would say tend to thrive doing the sort of work that you're doing, or character qualities that are required for a person who's going to do the kind of work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, there are good ones and bad ones. I would say for the good ones, I would say diligence. Being willing to do the hard work. The tough part about politics for a lot of people is that most of it isn't glamorous. It's not stuff that is Instagram worthy. It's not stuff that you're going to get praised over. But if you really want to come up in it, you have to be willing to do the stuff that nobody sees. And that's the same thing with advocacy. Even with the AND campaign, we get people who are excited about it, but they get less excited very quickly when they see it's not all glamorous. It's not all stuff that you're going to be able to tweet about. It's just hard work sometimes. And if you're willing to do that hard work, if you're willing to educate yourself on the issues, then I think, you can do a good job. A lot of times you see people who can be somewhat narcissistic, and that's the way that they make it through all the criticisms. I don't think you have to be that, though. There are some very unassuming politicians that just do the work and get it done. But one thing I try to do is read political biographies, and you'll see in political biographies, there are a lot of different types of personalities that kind of can shine in politics. But I would say that diligence, that integrity is going to shine through if you have the fortitude and kind of the resilience to stick with it. It's something that can be successful. And what I want to tell people too, it's not just about being a candidate. There are so many ways to be involved in politics like I am without being a candidate. So people always assume that I want to be a candidate, but I'm like, there's a lot of influence, and you can help a lot of people and not necessarily be the candidate. And so that's important to understand as well.
That's very helpful. Thank you. There's another question from Kara. And she says, how can those of us who are not as intimately involved in politics support those who are? And what can we do specifically to support organizations like the AND campaign?
Great question. I think one of the things that we have to get back to is the value of institutions. And the truth of the matter is, and Michael Ware says this really well, politics really isn't an individual endeavor. Certainly we go into the voter booth by ourselves and come out by ourselves. But at the end of the day, it's really to be done in community. And if you want to have an impact, you want to have influence, even if you're not somebody who's interested in being all in the middle of it, just support institutions that do speak for you in that regard, because they're going to have the time. Institutions have the time to focus on the policy and the small things that you may not have time to focus on. They have the expertise to do those things. And one of the best ways to support groups like the AND campaign or the Center for Public Justice is by sharing our content. We have a podcast called the Church Politics Podcast. You sharing that with your friends and people at your church is huge, because we're very much a grassroots organization, and that goes a long way for us. Obviously, there's financial resources, but everybody doesn't have that. And so spreading the word, showing support, giving, sending notes of encouragement, and advocating when you can be great ways to help out, even if you're not the person to be on the front lines. Look, everybody doesn't have to be on the front lines, but that doesn't mean that you don't have a valuable contribution to make.
We have another follow-up question. You mentioned biographies, and so of the biographies that you've enjoyed reading, which politicians or historical figures do you believe did the best job of integrating their Christian faith in their work? Who are some of the models that you look to?
Ooh, that's a good question. I read let me think about who. I mean, they're not all politicians. So I think you can look and I talked about him today. You can look at Frederick Douglass, who wasn't a politician, but very much was an advocate, was someone who had conversations with politicians. Again, I don't like to just focus on politicians. I think there are other people who do these things really well. So I think reading about Frederick Douglass, reading about Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day is somebody who, again, wasn't necessarily a politician, but had a lot of influence and really worked hard for the poor people, for workers. Somebody who else wasn't a politician is somebody like Fannie Lou Hamer. Advocates, people who are engaged, but weren't necessarily, I think she might have tried for office, but didn't have to be in office to have an impact and become a historical figure who was known for their Christian civic engagement. Let me try to give you one politician who I think has done it well historically. And there's a few. I mean, there were some aspects of Abraham Lincoln that were very good. He's certainly worth reading about. I think I just read a biography of John Bell Edwards, who is in Louisiana, who does a really good job and maintains Christian convictions. So I think those are two, but don't limit it to politicians. I would look at other political actors or civic actors as well.
Another question is connected to what you were just talking about. Who are some other politicians in today's culture that you could point to who have similar values of the AND campaign and that young politicians could look up to? Maybe names that we might not be familiar with, who don't get as much exposure, but that are doing it faithfully, diligently, maybe without as much exposure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be a broken record, but one of my heroes is Katrina Jackson again in Louisiana, and I'll just be honest with you. It's not easy. You're not going to see it a lot on the national stage. You just don't see it as much as you should on the national stage. But I think people like Governor Bill Haslam, who was the former governor in Tennessee, and maybe somebody who could run for higher office at some time. I think that's a good one. I think Mayor Hancock in Denver does a pretty good job. But I'll say this: I think the next generation is really going to have to emphasize what I see as the two battles today. And I think we have to make sure that we are addressing the social justice conversations in a real way, because the church has left a void in that's being filled by others, and we need to be a part of that conversation. But we also need to realize that there's another front of this, which is the moral order conversation. And so I think the next generation of Christian political leaders and civic leaders are going to be the ones who can focus on both, that can break out of those ideological molds and say, no, I care about justice and I care about moral order because the Bible tells me that's what I need to care about. And I don't need to fit into one of these two kind of pigeonholes.
There's another question about if you would add any political activists to that list, or who are some political actors or people that are helping us think about this in a new way. You had mentioned this morning, some names like Esau McCauley and Alan Noble. Are there any other names that you would give us to read, to get their books, to listen to their podcasts that could help expand the voices that we're listening to as we try to carve out this Christian, distinctively gospel-centered way?
Sure. I think Chris Butler, who is a pastor and politico in Chicago. I think Gabriel Salguero, who is a Hispanic leader who does just excellent work. He stands up and he doesn't fit. He actually gave a prayer at the Democratic National Convention, but the prayer talked about life. It talked about things that you wouldn't normally hear there. And that's what Christians need to start doing. Christians need to go into spaces and not just say what they're expected to say, but really shine a light into that space and say something that they might not be expected to say, but that's the truth. There's so many people that to touch on. I think I may have named Lisa Fields is another good one. Leonce Crump, Pastor Leonce Crump does a really good job with those conversations. Pastor John Onwuchekwa. I could send you a list, but those are some good ones to check into, and plenty of content between even those names that I just kind of shouted out. Also, Catherine Freeman. Catherine Freeman is at Baylor in Texas, and she does a really good job as well.
That's great. Thank you. There's another question that's come in here. That politics often seems to divide churches more than unite, and rather than creating community, it divides us. Are there times when we should focus more on unity, and so we should set political conversations aside? How do we discern when to try to preserve unity and when to have these difficult conversations? How do you think about keeping the unity of a church or of a community or of a family when there are these important political discussions that we have to have?
Yeah, I think we need to be very careful by saying that we have to get rid of the political conversations to not be divided. I mean, in a way, that's almost saying that the gospel or our the communion of the saints isn't powerful enough to overcome the divides that can come with politics. I just don't think that's true. I think it's about how we address it. So Justin, I think the number one thing we need to do as Christians on both sides is separate our party and our ideology from our identity. And so let me tell you the best way to know if you've been able to do that. Justin could say anything he wants about, he could criticize, he could even insult the Democratic Party or the leaders of the Democratic Party. And I wouldn't take that as an insult against me, because guess what? My identity's not in that. And that it should be for everybody. If you're a Republican, somebody in your church should be able to criticize or even insult the Republican, and you not feel like they've insulted you. But if you can't make that separation, then I think that's what's unhealthy. And that's why we get into fights, and that's why we get so upset, because we're too tied to these parties and we're too tied to these ideologies. If we separate ourselves from that a little bit, focus on what we have in common, which is a lot we have in common. I mean, the same Great Commission, the same Great Commandment, we worship the same Lord. If we focus on those things and the justice and the moral order that God has sent us into the public square to promote, then it doesn't have to be divisive. But again, be very careful with almost saying that the gospel can't overcome this particular divider. If we bring any issue in the church, that it has to divide us. That's not the truth. We have something more powerful than politics, and politics will not overcome the cross.
Thank you. Let me ask you one final question here. How would you advise us to pray over the next few days or over the next few months for our elected officials, especially if we object to their policies and to their characters and their actions? How do we think about praying for our elected officials?
Yeah, I mean, prayer, I think, is the first thing that we should be doing in this political, in what's going on in this political landscape right now, and especially for the people who we don't like. I've really tried to make that a practice of mine, to pray for people that I have an issue with, because it's hard to hate somebody when you pray for them. It's hard to really stay bitter when you sit down and you pray for the best for somebody. And that doesn't mean that you're praying that they succeed in the wrong things that they're doing, but you pray that God speaks into their heart. And I would be careful to say, I'm praying so that you get everything that you want them to do, but say, hey, God, have your way and work, your will within them. And pray, pray for them in a way that is almost that helps you too, right? That helps change your view of the conversation. Again, you can pray for somebody in the morning and still advocate against something they're doing during the day, right? So it doesn't mean that you're accepting what they're doing, but I think praying for the country, praying for whatever leader wins tomorrow or however long it takes, is going to be something that not only that I think Christians are supposed to do, but I think it'll be helpful in your perspective. Because again, and one thing the AND campaign has been saying this whole week, or been saying for the last few weeks, is Christians are going to need to be peacemakers in this conversation. Not necessarily peacekeepers that are not dealing with issues and just trying to say, hey, we just want people to be quiet. No, but by pursuing justice, pursuing civility, really saying, hey, I'm not going to trade insult for insult, but I am going to try to find solutions. And I think that has to be the posture of the Christian going into what's going to be a pretty crazy time.
Can I ask you one more question? It just came in as I was saying one last question. This is a question about those of us who feel that the church is not saying enough about justice and feeling like we have to look outside the church to find voices about justice. How would you encourage us to advocate for justice conversations, perhaps if we feel the church isn't saying enough? How can we do that respectfully and humbly to advocate for more sensitivity towards questions of justice?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you have people who do feel like their church isn't saying enough. And I would just, I think the first thing is to seek to understand why they feel like that's not a subject that needs to be broached. Just have the conversation. And sometimes you'll find, pastors don't know everything, right? And so sometimes it's a hard conversation for folks to have. Maybe there's, areas where you can suggest biblical Orthodox Christians who talk about justice. And a lot of the people that I just named, that's a way to kind of go about it. Some people are afraid that if someone comes in there and talks about justice, it's going to be a completely secular, progressive conversation that goes outside of the lines of what is biblical. I understand that concern, but there are a lot of biblical Christians who have a high view of scripture, high view of Christology, that can talk about justice in a way that is very helpful. So maybe it's exposing them to some of the people that I named before, exposing them to those speakers who can do it in a biblical way. And I think that's one way to go about it, but seek to understand, you can ask questions, and you can, push a little bit to say, hey, I think this is what we need to do. If we look at what's going on, this will really help us have a more full conversation. But I think pointing them to resources and books is a very good way to start. You can't control whether somebody reads it or not, but offering it can be a good start.
Thank you so much. Well, Justin, let me just say on behalf of everyone at Dort that we are so thankful for your ministry to us today. And thank you for taking the time to prepare the remarks and to speak to us and to talk to our students. You've been so generous with your time and with your ministry. And we pray blessings on you as you continue in your ministry. Your ministry has been an oasis in a desert that we're walking through right now. So thank you so much for.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Justin. Thank you.